Alright guys, this is going to be our first video for APUSH on Tuesday, March 31st. We'll be wrapping up the APUSH unit of Unit 3, which ends at around 1800. But the reading pack is going to keep going past that. We're going to keep going into APUSH Unit 4, basically 1800 Jefferson and beyond. So, just to kind of keep things less confusing. Anyway, so we're picking up, still in Washington's administration. We did pretty much all his domestic policy stuff yesterday, so today we're going to do his foreign policy, farewell address, Republican motherhood, and then Adams, and wrap up Unit 3. So during his second term, Washington sent John Jay to England to negotiate a treaty concerning the evacuation of the British from the Northwest Territory, as stipulated in the Treaty of Paris that concluded the Revolutionary War, as well as to discuss British violations of free trade. Although Jay's treaty prevented war with Great Britain, opponents of the treaty believed Jay made too many concessions towards the British, who in essence were not respecting our rights as a sovereign nation. The treaty also involved paying some war debts. Jay's treaty is often considered to be the low point of Washington's administration. Jay himself was burned in effigy in the streets of New York. At the same time, Washington sent Thomas Pinckney to Spain to negotiate use of the Mississippi River, duty-free access to world markets, mainly New Orleans, and the removal of any remaining Spanish forts on American soil. During the mission, Pinckney was able to extract a promise from Spain to try to prevent attacks on Western settlers from Native Americans. The Treaty of San Lorenzo, also known as Pinckney's Treaty, was ratified by the U.S. Senate in 1796 and is often considered to be the high point of Washington's administration. The next year, however, Congress attempted to withhold funding to enforce the treaty. The House of Representatives asked Washington to submit all documents pertinent to the treaty for consideration. Washington refused, establishing the precedent of executive privilege. The right of the president to withhold information when doing so would protect national security. In example, the case of diplomatic files and military secrets. The end of Washington's presidency was monumental as its beginning was. Wishing to set a final precedent, Washington declined to run for a third term. In his famous farewell address, composed in part by Alexander Hamilton, he warned future presidents to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. Washington's call for neutrality defined American foreign policy from 1800 until the late 1890s, at which point the United States pursued a policy of imperialism, and then again at the end of World War I until 1941. All right, Republican motherhood. During the 1790s, women's roles of courtship, marriage, and motherhood were all reevaluated in light of the new republic and its ideals. Although women were largely excluded from political activity, they had an important civil role and responsibility. They were to be the teachers and producers of virtuous male citizens. While public virtue had been strictly masculine quality in the past, private virtue emerged as a very important quality for women, who were given the task of inspiring and teaching men to be good citizens through romance and motherhood. The idea here is that a woman should entertain only suitors with good morals, providing more incentive for men to be more ethical. Women also held a tremendous influence on their sons, leading advocates for female education to speak out, arguing that educated women would be better mothers who would produce better citizens. Even though the obligations of women had grown to include new political meaning, traditional gender roles were largely unchanged, as the education of women was meant only in the service of husbands in the family. All right, now going to the Adams presidency. The Electoral College selected John Adams as a Federalist as Washington's successor. Under the then current rules, the second-place candidate became vice president, and so Adams' vice president was Democratic-Republican Thomas Jefferson. Following the Washington era, Adams' presidency was bound to be an anti-climax. Adams, argumentative and elitist, was a difficult man to like. He was also a hands-off administrator, often allowing Jefferson's political rival, Alexander Hamilton, to take charge. The animosity between Jefferson and Hamilton and the growing belligerence between Federalists and Democratic Republicans set the ugly divisive tone for the Adams term. Perhaps Adams' greatest achievement was avoiding war with France. After the United States signed the Jay Treaty with Britain, France began seizing American ships on the open seas. Adams sent 3 diplomats to Paris, where French officials demanded a huge bribe before they would allow negotiations to even begin. The diplomats returned home, and Adams pushed for their written report in the newspapers. Because he deleted the French officials' names and replaced them with the letters X, Y, and Z, the incident became known as the XYZ affair. As a result, popular sentiment did a complete turnaround. Formerly pro-French, the public became vehemently anti-French to the point that a declaration of war seemed possible. Aware of how small the American military was, Adams avoided the war, a war Hamilton wanted, and negotiated a settlement with a contrite France. The low point of Adams' tenure was the passage and enforcement of the Alien and Sedition Acts, which allowed the government to forcibly expel foreigners and jail newspaper editors for scandalous and malicious writing. The acts were purely political, aimed at destroying new immigrants, especially French immigrants, support for the Democratic Republicans. Worst of all, the Sedition Act, which strictly regulated anti-government speech, was a clear violation of the First Amendment. In a scenario almost unimaginable today, Vice President Jefferson led the opposition to the Alien and Sedition Acts. Together with Madison, he drafted the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which were technically anonymous, which argued that the states had the right to judge the constitutionality of federal laws. The resolutions went on to exercise this authority they claimed, later referred to as nullification. By declaring the Alien and Sedition Acts void, Virginia and Kentucky, however, never prevented enforcement of the laws. Rather, Jefferson used the laws and resolutions as key issues in the 1800 campaign for the presidency. So this is where the APUSH Unit 3 ends. APUSH Unit 3 covers like French and Indian War, Revolutionary, taxing period, all the way up until Adams' presidency. Now we're getting to 1800, the election to get Jefferson president, and then beyond. So now we're transitioning into Unit 4 for the APUSH guidebook. Okay, the Revolution of 1800. By 1800, the Federalist Party was split, clearing the way to the presidency for Democratic Republicans. Two men ran for the party nomination, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. Each received an equal number of votes in the Electoral College, which meant the Federalist-dominated House of Representatives would be required to choose a president from between the two. It took 35 ballots, but Jefferson finally won. Alexander Hamilton swallowed hard and campaigned for Jefferson, with whom he disagreed on most issues and whom he personally disliked because he believed Burr to be a most unfit and dangerous man. Burr later proved Hamilton right by killing him. The election was noteworthy for two reasons. For the second time in many elections, a president was saddled with a vice president he did not want. That problem was remedied in 1804 with the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, which allowed electors to vote for a party ticket. The other, more important reason the election was significant is that in Americans' first transfer of power from Federalists to Democratic Republicans, no violence occurred, a feat practically unprecedented for the time. Jefferson referred to his victory and the subsequent changeover as a bloodless revolution. All right, the Jeffersonian Republic. Note, the next two sections primarily review political history. They are followed by a review of social and economic history between 1800 and 1860, because many of the important social economic trends of this era developed over the course of several decades. The economic and social conditions of this period also played a major role in bringing about the Civil War, and the AP exam often tests them in this context. That's why we'll review them as we get closer chronologically to the Civil War. Okay. Jefferson's first term. The transition of power from the Federalists to the Democratic Republicans may have been a bloodless one, but it was not a friendly one. Adams was so upset about the election that he left the Capitol before Jefferson took office in order to avoid attending the inauguration ceremony. Before he left town, however, he made a number of midnight appointments, filling as many government positions with Federalists as he could. Jefferson's response was to refuse to recognize those appointments. He then set about replacing as many Federalist appointees as he could. He dismissed some, pressured others to retire, and waited out the rest. By his second term, the majority of public appointees were Democratic Republicans. Jefferson's refusal to accept Adams' midnight appointments resulted in a number of lawsuits against the government. The case of Marbury v. Madison, reached the Supreme Court in 1803. William Marbury, one of Adams' last appointees, had sued Secretary of State James Madison for refusing to certify his appointment to the federal bench. Chief Justice John Marshall was a Federalist, and his sympathies were with Marbury, but Marshall was not certain the court could force Jefferson to accept Marbury's appointment. Marshall's decision in this case established one of the most important principles in the Supreme Court, judicial review. The court ruled that Marbury did indeed have the right to his judgeship, but that the court could not enforce his right. Why? Although the power to do so had been granted to the Supreme Court in the Judiciary Act of 1789, Marshall now declared it unconstitutional. In one fell swoop, Marshall had handed Jefferson the victory he had wanted, while simultaneously claiming a major role for the Supreme Court, the responsibility for reviewing the constitutionality of congressional acts. Throughout the rest of his tenure, Marshall worked to strengthen that doctrine and thus the court. We'll stop video 1.